tell you a bit about GOPAC?
About GOPAC, yeah, and mission of GOPAC.
Okay. Well, despite the name, GOPAC isn't a dance. GOPAC is a worldwide association of democratically elected parliamentarians who have come together to fight corruption and to fight for democracy in their countries. We have parliamentarians in most of the countries of the world, but we have national chapters in 50 countries, and Ukraine is one of them. To be a national chapter, you need to have parliamentarians from both sides of the house, so opposition and government parliamentarians who are committed to working together instead of against one another to try to serve the public good. Across the world, the organization works with our national chapters to support their agendas and their works, to pass laws, regulations, to, in some cases, pursue individual acts of corruption by government or government actors. But our work is very different depending on whether it is a country that might be a new democracy, a country that is a mature democracy, a country that may have come out of a recent conflict. We, for example, have many chapters in countries in the Arab world who have come out of the Arab Spring, and many of those uprisings were really uprisings against corruption. I'm here this week to meet with our members in GOPAC Ukraine to support them immediately in a meeting they're holding on asset recovery on Thursday, but more broadly to work with them in their efforts to try to reduce corruption in the country. I think what is unique about Ukraine for GOPAC is that it is a country that is in the middle of a very dramatic change, and no one really knows how it's going to end. We have countries that we work with, for example, in Tunisia and Morocco, in Tunisia, which has went through a revolution and now is trying to rebuild. We have other countries who have never been through a revolution, like Canada, for example, but are trying to improve the public integrity of their institutions. Ukraine is unique for us because it's the only country where we have a national chapter that is in the middle of it's at a decisive moment in the fight against corruption. Our global organization has sent me here not just to support the efforts this Thursday, but because we think that what will happen in the next 6 months to a year will decide in a very real way whether Ukraine succeeds or fails as a democracy. Our sense is that the last presidential administration was toppled for many reasons. In part it was the president's policy about Europe, in part it was tensions between different parts of society, but we think that underlying all of it was an enormous level of corruption in that government, and that many of the decisions they took, both with regard to the East and West, towards Europe and Russia, were decisions that were influenced purely and almost exclusively by the fact that they were doing whatever they could to steal as much money as possible. Really, all the issues that Ukraine faced under that government were issues of corruption. But now that that government has been ousted, that doesn't necessarily mean that the fight is over. It just means that the first stage in the fight is over, because there's a very real possibility, and it's happened in many countries, that removing one corrupt government that is removed is just followed by another corrupt government. And many countries who have had uprisings and revolutions have found that instead of getting a change, they've just received an exchange, that it's just a different group of people who are stealing the money instead of a new system that prevents theft. So we feel that during this very delicate period, there's a time for the international community to help the people of Ukraine to ensure that the sacrifices that they made to remove the previous government are not sacrifices in vain. When I think about, I was just down in the Maidan earlier today, and when I think about, I found it very moving to see the pictures of the people who died during the uprising, and I think it would be a terrible thing for their families to think. I mean, it's terrible to lose someone you love at any time, but there is an honor and dignity in feeling that we lost someone for a greater cause, that his death or her death helped to make our country a better place. It would be a terrible thing if the next government of Ukraine ended up being just as corrupt as the last one, and those people had to feel that not only did they lose their children, their parents, their siblings, their spouses, but that they had lost them in their lives, and that sacrifice didn't mean anything. So that is why we're here, to try to work with the parliamentarians, to try to take advantage of this moment in history to reform Ukraine's institutions and to try to change Ukraine's political culture. It's not going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be very, very difficult. But I think that, and I'm not going to tell you that politicians are going to become more honest tomorrow, just overnight. That's not going to happen. But what I think has happened is that politicians, whether they are honest or corrupt, know that there's a limit, that the government had crossed that limit. So hopefully that will encourage them, if not necessarily to be honest people, but to do the right thing at least some of the time, so that the next government isn't perfect, but that it is less corrupt than the government that came before. That's basically my mission.
Yeah. And a little question: what do you think, Mr. What country in America, North or South America, like Ukraine situation for you?
It's an interesting question. I don't think there's any country in the world that's exactly like Ukraine. There are many countries that have gone through similar times. If I had to, in North and South America, I might suggest Chile, because they had a period of dictatorship, for example, a very corrupt dictatorship, and that country still has many challenges, but at least they now have a functioning democracy. Another example might be Brazil, which also had periods of dictatorship and also has very high levels of corruption. But in the past 5 to 10 years, they have been making very significant strides towards becoming less corrupt. Again, they still have a very high level of corruption, but things are better today than they were 10 years ago. Again, I think what is unique about Ukraine is that at this point, whereas with Chile, the dictatorship is over, and with Brazil, they are moving in the right direction, Ukraine is balancing on a knife edge right now. It could very easily fall back to the way it was in the previous regime. And I think that it's important, I think everyone knows that the last presidential regime, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was a product of the political system. And although that president is gone, the same political system that created that presidency is the system that's currently in place. It's not just the person who has to change, it's the system itself that has to change so that it doesn't keep reproducing dishonest and crooked political leaders.
Mr. Maharaj, what your plan or in Ukraine, in government, in Верховна Rada, Parliament, or other government offices?
Well, in the very short term, just during this trip, as I mentioned, there's a conference being organized by GOPAC Ukraine on asset recovery, and that is to discuss what is it that the current interim government should do to try to recover some of the money that was stolen by the previous government. And that is actually a very, very difficult thing to do. If you look at the Arab Spring countries, when the revolution started going through that part of the world and dictators could see that their time was coming, one of the very first things they did was just get all their money out of the country, because they knew there was a good chance that they were going to be toppled. And in most of those countries, even after the dictators were brought down, in some cases even after the dictators were executed, almost none of their money came back to their people, to their country. In part it's because money has no nationality, and when it's out of the country it's very hard to trace. But in addition to that, there are financial institutions that who are not enthusiastic about giving back money and giving it up. And it's also, as we all know, it's not just one individual who runs a corrupt government. That one individual is at the top of a pyramid of a vast number of corrupt people who enable his corruption. And so when the regime falls apart, they all run and they all take some of the money with them. That's not to say it's impossible. It is possible, but it is very difficult, and it's a long-term process. So in the immediate term, I'm working with Ukraine's parliamentarians to discuss what has worked in asset recovery, what has not worked, and some of the basic steps that the Parliament needs to do to try to identify funds that belong to the people of Ukraine outside of the borders, and the steps that they need to take with international institutions and with foreign governments to recover those funds. In the longer term, I'm meeting with our members to talk about their legislative plans, and really, as a global organization, we will support the plans that they develop with the people of Ukraine. I believe that those plans will fall probably with three main thrusts. One will be the creation of a meaningful and independent anti-corruption commission. One of the reasons why many political actors in the executive and in parliament have been corrupt is because they police themselves. And if you are the one who's responsible for sending yourself to jail, you're probably not going to do it. So an independent anti-corruption commission will be an important part of making sure that the next group of parliamentarians and the next president are kept honest by an external body. The second area, I believe, will be on asset declarations, and that is to make it. There are already laws in Ukraine that require public servants and politicians to spell out what their interests are, how much money they have, where it came from. The system isn't very well policed. There are very few consequences if people if they lie, and indeed there's very little investigation so that anyone knows whether they've lied, whether they've been truthful.
Yeah.
So that has to be cleaned up.
Yes, this is our newspaper
You'll have to tell me what it says.
investigation. Yeah. You can read when you study Russian.
And